Welcome back to another video on the book of Daniel. In this video, we're going to be going through the AntiChrist Theory. Okay, so far we've been talking about the correct interpretation for chapter 11 of Daniel, and we've been using the historical approach, which breaks chapter 11 into three sections. The first section here in blue is verses 3 to 35, which is a historically accurate account of the battles between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, known as the kings of the north and the kings of the south. Now, the final thing that happens in this section is Antiochus IV appears. We then move into the next section, which is verses 36 to 39, which under the historical approach is a description of Antiochus IV. We then move into the final section here in red, verses 40 to 45, which is a description of the last days. So this is the end of the world. Now, under the historical approach, what this means is that the end of the world happens in 160 BC when Antiochus is king. Now, hopefully you can appreciate the challenge that this would pose to a believing Christian view of the book of Daniel. If you take the historical approach, what you're in essence saying is that Daniel was wrong, because the historical approach claims that verses 36 to 45 speak about Antiochus IV, thus the end of the world will occur in about 160 BC. So now the obvious question is there another approach we could take that doesn't say that the book of Daniel is incorrect? So now we're going to see what that theory is, and what I'm going to call this is the religious approach to looking at chapter 11 of Daniel. So what is the religious approach? Well, we again break up chapter 11 into these three parts. Verses 3 to 35 is not controversial. Everyone agrees that it's describing the battle of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and everyone agrees that the last thing that happens in it is we're introduced to Antiochus IV. Now, where the religious approach becomes different is in the orange section, verses 36 to 39, which it claims is describing the Antichrist and is not describing Antiochus. So we have the end of the world figure, the Antichrist. And then this continues into verse 40 to 45, where it again is going to claim that it's describing the Antichrist as the world ends. Now, according to the religious approach, the end of the world doesn't happen in 160 BC. Rather, it happens in the future. When I say future, I mean future to us. It has not yet happened. So, to summarize the religious approach contends that verses 36 to 45 no longer speak about Antiochus IV, but rather the Antichrist. Thus, the end of the world is still in our future. So hopefully you can appreciate why the religious approach is so attractive to believing Christians, because it's the only approach that allows you to say that Daniel is not wrong. Otherwise, if you take the historical approach, what you're saying is that Daniel incorrectly predicts the end of the world in 160 BC. But now, I'm going to become a little bit controversial, because I'm going to claim that the religious approach is an untenable position. So, why is the religious approach wrong? Well, I believe it's wrong for one very simple reason, and that's because it makes a huge leap in time in only one verse. We can all agree that Antiochus IV lived in about 160 BC, and the Antichrist is a figure that lives at the end of time. So we don't know exactly when he's going to appear, but it has to be a date later than 2000 AD. It has to be like 2500 or 3000, or maybe he's coming back next year, but it has to be greater than 2000. So what that means is, under the religious approach, from verse 35 to verse 36, we leap more than 2,000 years forward. Now, there's nothing in the text that would lead us to that belief. There's nothing in the text that says we're now making this gigantic leap in time. This is something that is read entirely into the text. And we can see this very clearly by comparing verse 35 to 36. So let's bring up both of these verses. So verse 35 here, everyone's going to agree, is during the time of Antiochus. It reads, quote, "Some of the wise shall fall, so they may be refined, purified, and cleansed until the time of the end. For there's still an interval until the time appointed," end quote. We broke down that verse in a previous video, please refer to that. But everyone's in agreement, both the historical and religious approach, that this is describing a time during which Antiochus is king. But now we come to verse 36, which according to the religious theory, we have now jumped 2,000 years forward in history. It reads, quote, "The king shall act as he pleases. He shall exalt himself and consider himself greater than any god and speak horrendous things against the God of gods," end quote. Now, despite the fact that this describes Antiochus perfectly, the religious theory is going to claim that this king is in fact the Antichrist. But can I ask you, where in the text does it say that we're moving centuries forward in time? It simply is not there. It is totally imagined. And that's why I believe the religious theory is simply untenable. And that's exactly what Hartman writes in his commentary, quote, 1136 to 39, despite occasional obscurities, refer certainly to the biography of Antiochus, and so say nothing at all of a future Antichrist, as many of the older commentaries used to believe. The Antichrist interpretation of these verses is exegetically witless and religiously worthless. End quote. A very powerful statement there by Hartman, but he really does reflect the majority of scholars when it comes to this issue. You're only ever going to come across the religious approach to Daniel 11 in popular literature. For example, if you came across a book like this, Mark Hitchcock's The Amazing Claims of Bible Prophecy. Let's read this and see what Hitchcock writes. He says, quote, in Daniel 11:36, Antiochus suddenly fades into the background and the ultimate Antichrist emerges in full view. Daniel 11:36 leaps from the time of Antiochus and the Maccabean period to the time of the Antichrist. We know this because Antiochus did not fulfill the prophecies of Daniel 11:36 to 45. Also, the text clearly indicates that verses 36 to 45 concern the end of times. Daniel 11:35 ends with the words, until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time, end quote. Can we just stop here for a moment? Here, he draws our attention to the fact that verses 36 to 45 don't correspond with the life of Antiochus, and we agree with that. That's true, it doesn't correspond. But that doesn't mean we jump forward in time by 2,000 years. That's a total non sequitur. And also, in verse 35, I agree with him. It's quite clear that Daniel is describing the end of the world by the language that he uses. But again, that doesn't mean we leap 2,000 years in time. He is describing something that he believes is going to happen very soon. That's what the language says. So both of these claims that Hitchcock are making are totally bankrupt. All right, we keep on reading. What does Hitchcock say next? Between Daniel 11:35 and 36, we leap over the intervening centuries from Antiochus, the man who foreshadows the final Antichrist, to the final world ruler himself. This futurist interpretation is further confirmed in Daniel 11:40, which begins with the words, quote, at the end time, end quote. All right, so there is the religious approach summarized by Hitchcock there. And I think you can agree that it is not a strong argument. There is a lot of reading into the text here. So this is the way I like to visualize it. The historical approach lets the text speak for itself. We're drawing information out of the text and letting it speak for itself. When the religious approach reads into the text, it comes with its own bias and says, Daniel can't be wrong. Let's make sure we change it to get the view that we want. And I believe that's totally unjustified. We cannot change the text in order to get the reading that we want. We need to let the text speak for itself, and whatever it says, we just need to accept. And I believe that Daniel has incorrectly predicted the end of the world during the reign of Antiochus IV. I believe that's the clear reading of Daniel chapter 11 and 12, and even though we might want it to be correct, it simply isn't. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is the Amplified Bible, which is so fascinating. I'm absolutely torn about the Amplified Bible. There's a part of me that loves it, and there's a part of me that hates it. I don't know whether or not you should throw it in the bin, or you should go pick one up today. Let's first begin by talking about why I love it. I love how it translates verses 3 to 35. So that's the historically accurate part of Daniel 11. Let me show you what I mean by just choosing a few select verses. We're not going to read the whole thing here. I just want to pick 2 or 3 verses to show you this. So here is verse 11. The king of the south, Ptolemy IV Philopator of Egypt, will be enraged and go out and fight with the king of the north, Antiochus III the Great. And the Syrian king will raise a great multitude army. So as you can see here, I absolutely love what it's done. It's actually inserted the particular kings of the north and the south. It's telling you that in this verse, the king of the south is referring to Ptolemy IV, and the king of the north is referring to Antiochus III. I really feel that this makes Daniel 11 far more intelligible. You can read it and actually understand what it's saying. For instance, if we were to choose another verse at random here, let's now go to verse 18. It says, after this, he, Antiochus III the Great, the king of Syria, will turn his attention to the islands and coastlands and capture many of them. But a commander, Lucius Scipio Asiaticus of Rome, will put an end to his aggression. So here, it's telling us that this commander is Lucius Scipio. And it's from here that we're going to get our Treaty of Apamea and so on. Refer back to our previous videos. And hopefully you can see that by adding in these brackets and telling you explicitly who the king of the north and the south and who the commander is, it just makes the text so much clearer. Otherwise you're reading it and you really have no idea what it's saying. So I really do commend the Amplified Bible for doing this. I think it is absolutely fantastic. Another part, verse 28 says that then he, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, will return to his land with a great treasure plunder. So once again, it's identifying that the person in question here is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Fantastic, I love it. But now, when we come to verse 36 to 39, it does something that I think is unacceptable. It's clear that the Amplified Bible is biased at this point. It clearly thinks that the religious approach is the superior approach, and it lets that impact its translation. So let's now go to verse 36 and give it a read. It says, quote, "Then the king, the Antichrist, will do exactly as he pleases. He will exalt himself and magnify himself above every god," end quote. So do you see here that the Amplified Bible is telling you that the king here in question is the Antichrist? In my mind, this is where it ceases to be a translation and begins to become an interpretation, because there's nothing in the text that would lead you to believe that this is describing the Antichrist. Nevertheless, the Amplified Bible is inserting that in there. So I believe this is terrible for the Amplified Bible to do. Throw your Amplified Bibles out. But the Amplified Bible really allows us to appreciate where the religious theory breaks down, and that's in verse 40. Verse 40 makes no sense with the religious approach. Let's read verse 40 here with the Amplified Bible. It says, quote, "At the end time, the king of the south will push and attack him, the Antichrist, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots and horsemen and with many ships," end quote. So hopefully you notice here in verse 40, we have the king of the south, we have the Antichrist, and we have the king of the north. Well, this makes no sense at all. First of all, if we have jumped forward more than 2,000 years in history, who on earth are the king of the south and the king of the north now? Because we know at the beginning of this chapter, it was referring to the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. But now at the end, does it still refer to them? Hopefully you can just witness here how the religious theory breaks down, because all the patterns that we had seen at the beginning of the chapter now no longer apply, despite the fact that the context is exactly the same. This is really a weakness that verse 40 is showing us. And the person who really highlights the difficulty that verse 40 poses to the religious approach is Goldingay in his commentary. He shows us that the king of the north here must be referring to Antiochus IV. And he's really going to draw our attention to this him that is being referred to. This him must be the king of the north in order for this verse to make any sense. So let's now read what Goldingay says. He says, quote, "The him again presupposes that the northern king is the same person as that in verses 21 to 39. There is no hint of a transition to Antichrist or Antiochus V or Pompey and his associates," end quote. So here, Goldingay is saying that this him has to be the northern king, and it can't be transitioning to another king, like Antiochus V, or the Antichrist. That simply doesn't make any sense of the text, and I absolutely agree with him here. So that means that the historical approach, in my opinion, is the only one that really works. And yes, it does mean that Daniel has made a mistake, but it still makes the most sense out of the text. What doesn't make any sense is the religious approach. This is when you're no longer doing exegesis, you're doing eisegesis, and you're reading into the text in order to save Daniel from himself, because otherwise Daniel has made a mistake. Alright, that is where we're going to conclude this video. If you've enjoyed it, can I encourage you to become a patron? You're going to receive a bit of a longer version of this video in which I'm further going to discuss Goldingay's commentary, because he really does put forward an interesting argument. He's actually going to advocate for a position that is neither the religious nor historical one. He tries to find a middle ground, which is admirable. We're going to be reading through that. We're also going to be looking at Miller's commentary. He takes a very traditional religious approach, so it'll be good to break that down as well. So that's only going to be available to patrons, so please click that link in the description below, become a patron. It's nice and cheap, you can support the channel, and you're going to get so much good stuff from it. Now, if you're not in a position to give, please make sure that you hit that like button, leave me a comment, and subscribe. All of those things really help the channel grow. Thank you for watching until the end, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.